So, as much as I've ragged on Elden Ring's recycled bosses, and as much as I'll be dissecting the lesser quality bosses later on, none of that's to say that there are no great bosses to be found in Elden Ring. Like I said, several of those recycled bosses are actually pretty good despite their flagrant reuse. And there are several more bosses I'd like to give passing marks off to for just how good they are. Some of these bosses even see reuse in some regard, and in some cases they're pretty damn bad, but hey, a good boss is a good boss, and I want to give them their time in the limelight. These bosses include Godrick the Grafted, the Ancestor Spirit, the Mimic Tier, Starscourge Radahn, Ancient Dragon Lansseax, Loretta the Haligtree Knight, Godfrey the First Elden Lord, and Dragon Lord Placidusax. Let's start with the Mimic Tier, since it's obviously a very straightforward and simple fight. It's an NPC clone of the player, or at the very least whatever the player has equipped when they enter the boss room. However, there are a lot of different factors to consider once you realize this. For one, enemies in Elden Ring have infinite magic, because of course they do, so sorcerers and other magic users are likely to have a pretty rough time with this one. Melee players, however, will find themselves with a relatively straightforward opponent, however it's still fun to see you fighting what is essentially Elden Ring's albeit simpler answer to the Dark Link concept. The Mimic Tier also has a flask to drink from, though thankfully its stats and consumption count don't reflect the players as well. That would have been pretty ridiculous, so hey, thank you Elden Ring for knowing when to say enough was enough. I kind of wish you'd thought to apply that to, everything else in the game, but hey, you take the good, you take the bad. This fight can also be manipulated into being a total cakewalk if you so desire by entering the arena with no weapons equipped. When the Mimic Tier spawns, it will only have its fists, and as you are likely aware, that means its damage output will be downright pitiful. This might seem like a cheese strategy, because it is, but being able to intuit the strategy for yourself is pretty damn satisfying to say the least, and it's nice to be rewarded for that intuition. After it spawns, you can re-equip your weapons and proceed to decimate the poor thing. All in all, it's a solid fight. Far from exceptional, but still memorable in its own right. And for what it's worth, the reuse of it in a very obscure dungeon much later on in the game actually made for a pretty interesting encounter because it was something I genuinely didn't expect. It's pretty much the Mimic Tier, but much more powerful because, at that point in the game, your build is going to be much more powerful. I mean, it is a pretty straightforward reuse, but at the very least there is something there, something tangible to help make the encounter more unique and distinct compared to the original, which is something I feel that a lot of the recycled bosses are severely lacking. It's even more interesting when you consider that you might have respect your character at some point between these two encounters, meaning that the Mimic Tier itself would be a completely different fight from your original. And I think that's pretty cool. But let's move on to one of the game's first major bosses, that being none other than Godrick the Grafted. Yes, I ragged on Godfrey, but Godrick is an overall solid boss. Not perfect, but a certified Limgrave classic nonetheless. On a technical level, Godrick's hitboxes are pretty damn impressive, barring his projectiles, which are really difficult to gauge. It just doesn't feel like the visual quite matches up with what's actually hitting you, but I'm willing to let that one slide. One hitbox I'm not too certain about though would have to be from his ground slams, which work perfectly fine on a flat plane, but visually they look pretty off when the rubble is coming from the side of a hill, since the visual of the rubble was obviously designed for it to be used on a flat plane. Jumping does have iframes, so it's not impossible to jump over this still, but like I said, it can look pretty weird. For what it's worth though, I appreciate the fact that there is a boss this early on that teaches you how jumping can actually be a pretty valuable alternative to dodging. I also appreciate the fact that although his punish windows are fairly slim, it's not at all difficult to recognize when you're safe to go in for an attack, and you can easily get more than just a poke provided you're timing your attacks with relative proficiency. He does have one attack that kinda threw me for a loop, but I also immediately recognized that it was part of a combo and so was able to avoid it from then on. And it wasn't some super devastating attack either, so I had a fair window to recuperate and gather my bearings. He's far from unbearably oppressive, and I found the rhythm to his fight to be pretty consistent. Though there is one attack I want to complain about specifically, and that's the spin that he does when he's charging up his wind and for his phase 2 fire tornado attack. This thing could really have done with a stronger telegraph. You're pretty much guaranteed to take damage if you don't immediately identify it within the first handful of frames, and that can feel pretty cheap. It's not a crazy powerful attack or anything, in fact its damage is pretty minuscule, so it doesn't exactly ruin the fight by any stretch, but it can feel pretty cheap to take what feels like unearned damage, even if it is a pretty minuscule amount. Funny enough, I wasn't a big fan of his second phase when I started this script, however, as time has gone on and I've fought him more and more, I've actually grown to enjoy it, and I think it does a lot right. For starters, it still feels like the same fight. Without saying too much, I think a lot of Elden Ring bosses try to emulate what Ludwig did by having a second phase that basically feels like a whole new boss, and I don't think this works, most of the time. There is one exception, and you can probably guess what it is. Godrick's Phase 2 feels like an expanded iteration of his first phase, adding just enough to make it feel fresh, while also keeping in line with his first phase so as not to completely throw the player off, which was a great call not just for Godrick specifically, but also within the context of him being one of the pinnacle early game bosses. It does more than bosses like Margaret and the Godskin duo, but not as much as bosses like Rennala, Godfrey, Malekith, the final boss is... I really like Godrick, and his Phase 2 is no exception. The new moves take some time to figure out and can be very punishing, but once you do, it can feel pretty good to maneuver around them and take advantage of those punish windows. Some of these attacks can even be punished while they're still going off, provided you know what you're doing, and that can be really empowering to intuit on your own. I really want to highlight that because I think a lot of Elden Ring's bosses struggle with properly conveying what it is you're actually supposed to do in response to them, but everything about Godrick makes it pretty clear what you're supposed to do against any of his given attacks. I also want to give some passing remarks to Godrick's presentation because, honestly, it's incredible. Godrick's OST has rightfully earned its place amongst Elden Ring's most popular tracks, and his voice acting is genuinely superb. I initially wasn't the biggest fan of the Phase 2 transition. Admittedly, sticking the dragon head to his arm is pretty comical and over the top, but I've grown quite fond of it over time. I honestly couldn't even explain why. Maybe it's just because I've gotten so used to how outrageous the game can get with some of its boss transitions, but I don't know. I think he's cool. Overall, I really like Godrick. A couple of his attacks could be slightly more fine-tuned, but there's little about him that I can really criticize. Overall, he's a pretty fantastic boss. Another early game boss that I really loved was the Ancestor Spirit. This is still among my favorite bosses in the game. Yeah, it's not the hardest and it's far from Elden Ring's greatest spectacle of a fight, but it's still a pretty good boss and not to mention downright beautiful, with one of my favorite tracks in the game also accompanying the fight. I'll talk more about the artistic and auditory direction of Elden Ring in later parts, but the Ancestor Spirit just looks phenomenal and is easily one of the standout bosses on visuals alone, and same goes for the OST. Mechanically, the boss is pretty simple, only having a handful of well-telegraphed melee attacks and some magic that can be dangerous but is still ultimately quite easy to avoid. It's by far one of Elden Ring's easiest bosses, but similarly to bosses like True King Allant, Gwyn, the Living Failures, Lady Maria, Moon Presence, Storm King, and Yorm, the fight has enough substance backing it up to render this a non-issue. Not every boss needs to be as hard as Manus, Calamite, Ludwig, Midir, Gale, or the Nameless King. Sometimes all it takes is a beautifully presented enemy with interesting lore, and the Ancestor Spirit absolutely qualifies in that regard as a top-tier fight, at least for me. Then I encountered the Regal Ancestor Spirit. Allow me to convey to you my exact thought process when I first fought this thing. Alright, it's a recycled boss. Well, whatever I guess. Still a pretty cool boss though. Oh, it has an AoE now. Oh, and it's healing from it. Oh, okay. Thank you, Dark Souls. So, yeah, not sure why they felt it necessary to ruin a perfectly fine boss, but at least the initial Ancestor Spirit is still pretty great on its own. Similarly, Astel is a boss that I absolutely loved and honestly still do. Aesthetically speaking, Astel is downright fascinating with a design that feels appropriately otherworldly within the setting of Elden Ring. Not only that, but the arena is downright incredible, and the OST ain't half bad either. Astel was the perfect penultimate boss to cap off Ranni's already strong questline, and as far as I'm concerned is still one of the best bosses in Elden Ring, or at the very least one of the best moments in the game. I will say that Astel does have one attack I'm not a fan of though, and that's the grab. From what I've gathered watching other Elden Ring content and reading posts and comments by other players, the consensus seems to be that Astel would be better off without the grab, and I'm inclined to agree. That hitbox is seriously fucked. Not only that, but there's really no proper visual cue for the grab because you don't ever know where he's going to come from. Sure, if he happens to come down right in front of you, oh yeah, I can spot that a mile away. But if he comes in from a position where the camera isn't facing, then you're pretty much fucked without the audio cue, which isn't the worst thing in the world, but given just how hard it is to even read this grab, I just don't think it was enough to help mitigate the difficulty in even knowing when to dodge, and not in a way that feels fair either. Combine all that with the surprisingly high damage of this grab, and yeah, it's pretty bad. Otherwise, I think Astel's moveset is pretty excellent. Ignoring the grab attack, his hitboxes are all fairly tight. He's not so aggressive that his punish windows feel too slim or inconsistent. It's not at all difficult to intuit that his head is his weak point, but it's also not too much of a hassle to attack other parts of his body when that's simply not an option. For an enemy this big, he doesn't mess with the camera too much. He has a nice mix of attacks to dish out at close, medium, and long range, and the sheer spectacle of the fight is, pun intended, out of this world. FromSoft really did a great job with Astel. But sadly, they just couldn't help but reuse him. Yeah, it's a fully matured falling star beast. Look, I know, okay? You don't have to comment telling me that. I understand that Astel is actually the name of the species, or I guess the part of their life cycle when they've matured, like a butterfly. But I would at the very least hope you can understand just why it is that this is so jarring to see outside of Ronnie's questline. There is a reason that people are ragging on this and not the reuse of falling star beasts. Does anyone else remember in Mass Effect 3 Citadel DLC where they parodied the story with Sovereign's evil twin brother Sluggard? Yeah, this is that, but it's being played straight, as if somebody in the studio actually thought it was a genuinely good idea to take this cosmic horror abomination and give him a literal dark twin. It's honestly one of the worst boss reuses I've ever seen in a video game, not even just Elden Ring, and that is a real shame because Astel really is one of the most memorable and fantastic boss fights in this game. You know, it's kind of funny that Radahn would end up on this list, don't you think? To be perfectly honest, I was pretty mixed on this boss at first, but as time's gone by, I've really come to enjoy this fight. He's obviously far from perfect, but I still think he's great. Though the very start of this fight does leave a pretty negative impression. Radahn's fight starts out with him being really far out, like this arena is seriously gigantic. It might even be bigger than Gale's. Don't quote me on that though. And Radahn starts out halfway across this thing. Anyways, Radahn starts the fight by firing off powerful magical arrows repeatedly until you've gotten close enough to him that he'll start using other attacks. The fight will always start out this way, and there is literally nothing you can do about it. The arrows also have a fair amount of tracking because, of course they do, so good luck to anyone using heavy armor. I mean, that goes for anyone playing this game with a fat roll, but you get the idea. Thankfully, along the way you'll notice there are loads of summon signs, all of which can be activated regardless of the number of NPC summons that you have active, and they can all be activated with a simple tap of the interact button with no sub-menu asking for confirmation. This is fantastic, and it does a great job at building up the approach to Radahn, which feels very much like that of a raid boss. The Festival of Radahn was already a strong build-up to the boss, so the inclusion of this exciting run-up feels appropriately intense, even if it is rather repetitive on replay. Which is definitely gonna happen because this boss is no pushover. Also, if you summon Patches, he'll immediately dip. This is such a perfect and hilarious detail. I love that dickhead. After you've closed the gap, Radahn feels appropriately powerful the moment that he starts to charge you down. His sheer size is imposing enough, but he is downright ferocious. Radahn hits really hard and has surprisingly high mobility, but thankfully his attacks are appropriately spaced out, which is pretty nice when you're playing a game that has, you know, a stamina bar. So even though he is ferocious, he's far from the game's most unrelenting and oppressive fight. It can be difficult to tell where his aggro is when you've got so many NPCs helping you out, but his attacks already have a fairly wide sweeping range to them, so it doesn't feel like you're being left open to his attacks randomly clipping you. All of his attacks are well telegraphed, and you can pretty easily intuit that as long as you're at his front, you're going to want to keep your guard up. I will say, as far as Radahn goes on a visual level, he is interesting. On one hand, Radahn himself looks like an absolute beast, and the run-up to him at the start of the fight does a great job at conveying his sheer scale when he just seems to be getting bigger and bigger as you draw closer. Honestly, as far as Radahn himself goes, I think his visual design is incredible. Then there's Leonard. I don't really know what it was they were trying to do with this. It just looks really silly seeing this massive god of war riding a pretty normal-sized horse, and yeah, I know, Loveless, it's the gravity magic. Yeah, no fucking shit, I see that. It's very obvious, but maybe instead of the funny little horse, they could have just, you know, had him using his gravity magic to fly around. That would have been pretty menacing, not gonna lie. Loveless, it's because in the lore he loves his horse. Yeah, well, you know what? Write a fucking lore reason for him not to love the horse, I don't know. But seriously, Radahn is already a gravity magic caster, and he will use this magic to execute some pretty high mobility attacks, so why not just use that gravity magic for the duration of the fight to keep himself afloat? The horse just looks really silly, and I'm not sure if they want me to laugh at it or if I'm somehow supposed to take the visual seriously. But regardless, the fight is solid. Radahn can kill you very quickly if you're not ready for him, but honestly, there's very little about him that feels unfair or overtuned. I do wish the size of his AoEs had been brought down a peg, and the tracking on his rock projectiles can sometimes be a bit of a nuisance. It's just really difficult to naturally gauge what it is you're supposed to do against them. But aside from that, he is a great boss, and easily the best of the demigod fights as far as I'm concerned. Next up is Lansseax, who thankfully isn't a copy-paste of the same generic dragon that's already been used so many times over. You gotta admit, Lansseax makes one hell of a first impression at the entrance of the Altus Plateau, utterly barreling into the earth and charging up an enormous red lightning attack. I normally don't care for these sort of gotcha moments, as I've probably made clear throughout my critique, but I think Lansseax is a bit of an exception because of just how well executed this was, and it occurs just after a sight of grace, so it doesn't feel as if you're being punished so much as you're being given a very clear warning. It's not like it's wasting your time or anything, it's basically saying, "Welcome to hell, motherfucker!" It's a really cool moment. This is perhaps the most obvious case of a come back later boss fight, and that's perfectly fine given a significant portion of the game lies just beyond Lansseax. She isn't completely gatekeeping a single primary dungeon, and there are other paths to the area anyways, so this was the perfect spot to place her by all accounts. What's interesting is that when you do eventually return to fight her, she'll actually fly off after you've dealt so much damage, indicating that the real battle will be taking place somewhere else. With a bit of exploration and intuiting spots where such a massive enemy would be likely to appear, you'll eventually find Lansseax just outside the Lindell capital walls, and it's here where the real boss fight will finally begin. It's worth noting again just how massive Lansseax is. Seriously, this thing is utterly ginormous, being among the largest enemies across the entire Souls and non-Souls from catalog. Having the fight in an open field like this really was the perfect call, not only because it allows the arena to account for Lansseax's sheer scale, but also because it allows you to ride Torrent, who provides a much needed sense of escape for Lansseax's wider attacks. Going in and out from underneath Lansseax became a necessary aspect of my strategy, as her size makes it relatively easy to work her from underneath, but there were attacks that I simply could not, or at the very least struggled to find a method for avoiding whilst in that position. Utilizing Torrent to navigate my way around these attacks in particular felt like a very natural intuition, and the result was a satisfying back and forth where I slowly but surely began to wear Lansseax down, and I was overjoyed to finally have beaten her in such a satisfying manner. I will say that Lansseax has some fairly obnoxious AoE attacks, but like I said, I was quickly able to intuit that use of Torrent to circumnavigate the issue, and that feels like more than enough to shrug off what could initially seem quite obnoxious. This doesn't require you to respec your character completely or adopt some ridiculously hyper-specific strategy, it's just a matter of utilizing one of the core tools at your disposal. On the more mechanical side of things, Lansseax telegraphs her attacks very well and has fairly consistent hitboxes, which is both important and impressive for a boss of this size. Her damage is also understandably quite high, however I was impressed that From was willing to show a bit of restraint by not letting it be downright insane like many of Elden Ring's other late game bosses. And honestly, that design is kick-ass. Similarly to Astel, I consider her to be one of Elden Ring's standout moments of genuinely high-quality boss encounters. Then she shows up 2 more times as a non-boss in Fair Missoula. Would you please show some restraint next time, Miyazaki? My god. I suppose for what it's worth, I should mention that Lansseax is also reskinned into Fortisax and also another saxophone in the DLC. Fortisax at the very least looks quite a bit different and functionally has some unique mechanics going on with it, but that DLC saxophone is literally just Lansseax. Then there's Loretta, the Haligtree Knight, and while she might not have as much going on in terms of spectacle, and yes, she is used twice in two very notably different optional areas, I still think the boss is overall pretty good, especially given her placement in the game, at least relative to the progression of my first playthrough, though I will admit that is more of an anecdote. Loretta appears just prior to Ronnie's questline in the castle courtyard in Caria Manor, and then again at the end of the first section of the Haligtree dungeon. As I've made clear by now, I was not a fan of either Liurnia or the Haligtree, so having this genuinely great boss amidst those areas did feel like a major softening of those blows that each of those sections were. But again, I want to be clear, this is just how I personally felt. In any case, Loretta feels in many ways like what I'd have hoped that fantasy horseback warriors would have felt like to battle. I suppose she could be considered a rework of sorts of the Tree Sentinel to an extent, however her focus is far more so on magic than brute force. And thankfully, unlike the Erdtree avatar, it's more than just stapling magic onto a moveset and calling it a day. It's also worth noting that all of her spells can be learned by the player themselves. However, Loretta has the added benefit of mobility given that she has a steed, whereas in both fights the player won't have access to Torrent. While admittedly feeling like something of missed potential, this does create an interesting dynamic where the player is always looking up to and having to stand their ground against the boss, almost like a reverse POV of how it felt to ride Torrent against more common enemies. In many ways, Loretta feels like a souped-up version of the player character with both her skill set and movement, and in a weird way, it kinda reminds me of Artorias. I know that probably sounds weird at its face. I'm not at all suggesting that her moveset or design is even inspired by him, but she does in many ways feel like a reflection of the player character, which thematically does line up with what they were going for with Artorias, being this valiant knight of legend. Hopefully that makes sense, and if not, okay. Mechanically, I really enjoyed fighting and learning Loretta. She's not oppressively aggressive, and nothing about her feels like it needs to be tuned down to keep things relatively fair. She's fast and has mobility to take advantage of, but it's not so spontaneous that it'll give you whiplash like so many other bosses. She hits hard, but I don't think I've ever been comboed to death by her, let alone outright one-shot, so hey, that feels pretty good. Her moveset is varied enough to keep you on your toes, but manages to avoid ever feeling cheap, or as if she's ever going to catch you off guard with a gotcha that you can never feasibly telegraph. Loretta is honestly a fantastic boss, and was such a breath of fresh air compared to so much of what appears in her levels. I really wish we'd gotten more bosses crafted with this level of restraint and talent, but now we've finally arrived at what I consider Elden Ring's pinnacle bosses, and let me be clear once again that I consider these to be downright exceptional. Elden Ring has many issues, but I am not above praising it where I feel it deserves, and these two bosses absolutely deserve every bit of praise that they get. These two in particular are phenomenally well-crafted bosses and easily rank amongst my favorite across FromSoft's entire catalog. I consider Godfrey and Horaloo to be Elden Ring's best humanoid warrior enemy, and Placidusax not only Elden Ring's peak bestial enemy, but the single greatest dragon boss that FromSoft has ever and likely will ever produce. And as bad as some of their dragon fights are, the good ones are by no means to be scoffed at. So when I say that Placidusax is their best dragon boss ever, I really want to be clear just how high of praise that is. I genuinely cannot express just how much of an achievement I consider Godfrey and Placidusax to be. And I think if Godfrey was the final boss, then I would have had a far more favorable view of this game than I currently do, with Placidusax being what I consider the game's truest realization of a super boss, one that is epic in scope and especially hard, but also far from insurmountable despite how he may appear. I'm sorry if it seems like I'm just gushing, but I really want to hammer home just how outstanding I consider both of these fights. Starting with Godfrey, like I said, I would easily consider him the peak of what I would imagine was the intention for warrior enemies within the lens of Elden Ring's design philosophy. He is extremely aggressive with very high damaging attacks, sharp hitboxes, tracking that feels tuned exactly to where it needs to be, command grabs that feel extremely consistent once you figured them out, a phenomenal visual design, incredible OST, and not to mention fascinating lore that contributes to the feeling that this fight truly matters. It feels like all of the base mechanics play a role in this fight, from guard countering to jumping to avoid his ground attacks, and perhaps most impressively by this point in the game, a second phase that doesn't completely ruin the fight. In fact, Godfrey's second phase is excellent, but let's hold off on that for now. Godfrey's Phase 1 is an absolute powerhouse of a boss, with a fairly simple moveset revolving around his great axe and trying to overwhelm the player through consistent high-damaging attacks. Godfrey's attack patterns feel non-stop, rarely giving you a moment to gather your bearings, but his attacks are also not so rapid that there's no room whatsoever for follow-up. It feels like a proper back and forth, where you come to understand every single window of opportunity that you're allotted, and though you'll rarely get more than one attack in at a time, the constant stream of opportunities prevents that feeling of boredom and tedium that so many other bosses feel hard-coded to enable. That's the difference between Godfrey and other bosses. Other bosses have small punish windows between very lengthy combos, whereas Godfrey has very lengthy combos with consistent windows of punish between almost every single attack in those combos. Mechanically and thematically, it almost feels like you're becoming something of a reflection of Godfrey, which is appropriate given the thematic relevance of your quest to either become the next Elden Lord or ensure that the age of Elden Lords is finally brought to an end, and Godfrey being the very first of these lords amongst humans. As you begin to master the rhythm of the battle, you essentially take on the very same pattern of attacks as him. You're constantly laying into him and breaking him down as you exploit the many openings in his attack patterns. Nothing about the fight feels as if it's trying to pressure the player into remaining on the defensive. If anything, it actually encourages the player to play more offensively by having strong and fair telegraphing for each of his attacks, keeping his move pool fairly limited, and consistently hitting the breaks between his attacks and combos. Godfrey is simultaneously very aggressive, but also manageable, which is by no means an easy balance to achieve when designing a game like this, so even though I think FromSoft largely failed to strike this balance with the vast majority of their bosses, I do commend them for getting it so damn right with Godfrey. Then there's his second phase. Hoaraloo is a far more aggressive fight than that of Godfrey, however this is mitigated by the fact that many of his attacks also have notably long windups and are relatively easy to avoid. His strength lies in his ability to string together his attacks in a seemingly never-ending chain of combos, but it doesn't take long to realize that there are some fairly sizable gaps in his offense that are ripe for exploiting. This phase of the fight borders on being panic-inducing, however once you overcome that initial feeling of intimidation, you'll quickly begin to realize the openings in Hoaraloo's offense. Of course, recognizing those openings is far from all you need to defeat him. Knowing is half the battle, however it's important to be very familiar with your own attacks and their speed so as to maximize the effectiveness of your offensive potential. That would seem like a given for this game on the whole, however for this fight in particular, knowing your moveset in its entirety feels especially pivotal to overcoming him. I will say that Hoaraloo's sheer speed and ferocity can feel rather overwhelming at first, no doubt about it, but unlike so many other bosses which have so many potential methods for stringing together seemingly non-stop chains of attacks, Hoaraloo's openings are wide enough that you'll very quickly begin to recognize them, and it's very easy to identify even at a glance how you can apply your own offense between these many barrages. Hoaraloo also has quite a bit of tracking. Honestly, I'd put it on par with most Elden Ring enemies, and since I've criticized many of Elden Ring's enemies for their ridiculous tracking and will continue to do so, it would be unfair of me to gloss over it with Hoaraloo, and I suppose Godfrey also, so let's talk about that. During the first phase, Godfrey's attacks primarily consist of rather large swings with his great axe, and since his hitboxes are consistently as sharp as they are, the amount of tracking in his attacks is pretty negligible. It's not as if his axe will turn mid-throw to follow you, but he will throw it where he perceives you'll be moving, so understanding that isn't a hassle that forces you to rely on iframes to keep yourself from taking damage. Honestly, I don't have much to say about him as far as tracking goes. He's very consistent, and thankfully doesn't look as silly as certain other bosses that I'll be getting to eventually. Hoaraloo, on the other hand, is extremely aggressive and performs a lot of close-range melee attacks that string together very seamlessly and don't lack for tracking either. Of course, these aren't his only attacks that track, nor are they his only particularly dangerous attacks, but we'll get to the rest of his moveset soon enough. He also incorporates several vertical attacks such as a kicking uppercut and ground slam, which creates a small fissure that will require you to get out of the way, so it's easy to identify which direction you'll need to dodge to get out of harm's way. Normally I'm not the biggest fan of attacks that require you to dodge in a very specific direction, but at least here it's easy to pick up on where exactly it is that you're supposed to go and how you can apply that knowledge the next time around. It's pretty simple. Hoaraloo also has a staggering 3 command grabs, one for basically every range, but thankfully they're all pretty easy to avoid. The leaping command grab is probably his trickiest attack to work out the dodge for, however it is extremely consistent and has a highly interpretable telegraph to it that ensures you are made fully aware from the moment that he does it for the first time. Furthermore, he almost always starts his second phase with this or the mid-range grab, meaning that it'll quickly become burned into your memory as you fight him more and more. The close range grab is of course the easiest to dodge by far, and finally there's the mid-range grab, which can be dodged in any direction and doesn't even carry that much tracking anyways. Like I said, these things can be tricky initially, as can any boss attack, but they always avoid feeling as if they're just frustratingly impossible to deal with. The way I'm putting this might sound very simple, but that's because it is simple. Hoaraloo is a freaking animal. He is extremely intimidating when you first encounter him and does not seem to relent for even a moment. But soon enough, you'll begin to naturally recognize the consistencies in his attacks and the many windows of opportunity that will present themselves throughout the fight. He is a very hard fight, but he is by no means unmanageable or cheap. Every attack and combo feels like a mini lesson of sorts, but all of these lessons add up to one hell of a test of skill that is immensely satisfying to overcome. Godfrey is excellent, and I will never stop singing the praises of this fight because it is genuinely just that good. It's honestly the embodiment of everything that Elden Ring's bosses could have been. A hyper-aggressive but not unfair fight which keeps the player on edge at all times with a flurry of offense that is indeed quite punishing, but is also equally identifiable and manageable provided the player is paying proper attention. There are no cheap tricks, no petty attempts to swerve the player with an unfair gotcha. He's consistent, fair, and doesn't rely on subverting your instincts and intuitions. If anything, he rewards you for following your intuitions to their natural conclusions. Godfrey is an outstanding boss fight that manages to provide what I believe to be the second best of what Elden Ring has to offer in terms of combative potential. I say second best because I've been intentionally holding off on talking about the very best for last, that being none other than Dragon Lord Placidusax. I don't even know if I can put into words just how outstanding Dragon Lord Placidusax truly is. It is a marked achievement for this studio and feels like the culmination of all their work since this line of games first kicked off all the way back in the tail end of the 2000s. Dragon Lord Placidusax is inarguably FromSoft's greatest dragon boss they've ever created by a country fucking mile. It is light years ahead of even the best of their prior attempts at this type of enemy, and I seriously cannot laud them enough for making such a stellar boss battle in a game that I thought would never reach the heights achieved by this boss. This isn't even just the best dragon boss they've ever designed. Placidusax easily ranks among the best bosses that From has ever made, and that is absolutely saying something given some of their prior work. The visuals alone easily stand out as being among the best that Elden Ring has to offer, and I say that with full acknowledgement that Elden Ring's presentation on the whole is downright phenomenal. The atmosphere leading up to the fight alone is incredible, being flooded with anticipation for what's to come thanks to the mix of quiet ambiance sparsely broken up by the strikes of lightning from the storm surrounding the gigantic arena. The way Placidusax is posed has a unique air of mystery to it, vaguely resembling the fingers which the players will likely know by this point are similarly pointed to the sky as they seek to commute with the greater will. It's also appropriately strange to see this dragon with noticeably massive wings floating without even moving, almost as if to suggest that its power transcends the physical realm. That is just of course my own reading into what it could represent, but the visual remains uniquely intriguing all the same. It's also interesting to note that the cutscene itself doesn't actually initiate the fight. Its one and only purpose is to give you a good look at just what it is that you're about to throw down with before giving you a wide shot from your own perspective of this beast and the arena that you'll be fighting within. The sight is utterly breathtaking, and given just how old this thing appears, it's quite obvious that what we're dealing with has a lot more going on than the average Elden Ring boss. This thing is old. ancient even. And for players who've acquired and bothered to examine the Old Lord's talisman, they'll be able to pick up on the fact that Placidusax is actually missing 2 of its heads, possibly 3. This was a common theme in the original Dark Souls, where the bosses were far beyond their prime, which itself lended to a number of different thematic readings of those encounters. And on a visual level, it's just a really neat moment of storytelling. But finally, as the player approaches, the battle begins, and my god.
Oh, let's fucking go! Gotta say, this arena looks dope as fuck.
This arena's fucking godly. Oh,
Dragon
let's fucking
Lord
go!
Placidusax.
Look at him! Look at this dude!
Did he just throw my grenade back at me?
Look at this dude! Look at his head!
Oh my Lord, have mercy.
That is definitely.
Whoa, that fucking screen blur, dude!
So sick.
That screen-shaking bellow alone that signals the arrival of the Red Storm is awe-inspiring. What a way to start a boss fight. It is unironically fucking epic. This boss's visuals alone are commendable, but we haven't even started on the fight itself. The whole fight feels like it maintains a very natural sense of escalation that I can't help but appreciate. Like I said, Placidusax is an ancient being, likely eons beyond his prime, and so initially he does appear quite lumbering. But as with many creatures fighting to stay alive, the closer their back gets to the wall, the more dangerous they become.
Oh, oh, here we go.
We're in the second phase.
Look to the sky. Oh shit!
Oh shit!
Oh my god!
And the OST does a remarkable job at conveying this escalation, but I'll be holding off on that discussion for now. Not only is the OST terrific, but the storm itself will even grow more intense as you enter the second phase, perfectly conveying through the visuals the sheer power that Placidusax is about to unleash.
Oh my god, look at this attack! Look at this attack! This is so sick!
I didn't get to see it because I'm on the other side of it, but oh my god!
This is so sick!
Yo! Why is he cool though? Man, imagine sharing an area with fucking Malekith while being this dope.
Dude, Malekith Virgin versus Chad Placidusax.
Chad Political Ghidorah.
Oh, gravity beams! Oh shit!
Oh, what is this shit? Why is it in a Souls game?
Oh my god, he's so cool!
FromSoft have never lacked for spectacle with their bigger boss fights. Bosses like the Tower Knight, Abriatus, and Gale were outstanding in that regard, but Dragon Lord Placidusax is honestly in a league of its own. A perfect storm of audio-visual design coalescing into an unrivaled experience that I desperately wish Elden Ring had managed to make more of. But Placidusax isn't solely dependent on the audio visuals to carry the experience. Dragon Lord Placidusax is an ancient being, likely millions of years old, and that isn't just reflected in his visual design, it's also conveyed through the mechanics, specifically its attacks. Placidusax has combos, and he is far from lacking in power, but he's also quite lumbering and can really only pick up the pace in short but consistent bursts. This is great because it maintains a steady rhythm to the battle whilst making the punish windows perfectly clear, and insisting that you take his offensive capabilities very seriously. Placidusax's damage output is extremely high. His laser beams in particular will basically one-shot all but the highest vigor and defensively inclined players out there, and good fucking luck surviving the nuke. But best of all is the fact that these attacks never come out of nowhere. There's no gotcha, because all of them are designed to be extremely clear with the telegraphing that something big is coming, and it's up to you to get to safety. Dragon Lord Placidusax doesn't need ridiculous anime jumps and combos, it doesn't need cheap surprises, it never once makes the active decision to maliciously screw the player out of the fight. He is a consistent fight the whole way through, and though he does of course become more aggressive in the second phase, as one is likely to do when fighting for their life against an unwarranted invader, he doesn't pull out any particularly surprising attacks or unfair tricks. The only surprise in his arsenal is the transition to his second phase, phase, which consists of him disappearing before reappearing to charge the player down. This, however, is easily the most telegraphed attack besides the nuke, with Placidusax disappearing for a noticeable length of time, prompting the player to look around for him. Eventually, the player will see a swirling gray cloud with red lightning circling overhead, accompanied by a very distinct audio cue that you can even track with your ears, providing you have the setup. And shortly after, Placidusax will come barreling down towards them with an attack that will almost assuredly kill the player should they allow themselves to be hit. But again, the telegraphing is extremely transparent, so this never feels like a cheap death. It's apparent from the first time it happens that this attack is your sole responsibility to avoid dying to. And that really is the truth for the entirety of the fight. As big and sometimes aggressive as Placidusax can be, and as high as his damage output is, all of his attacks feel perfectly manageable. Some are a bit trickier than others, the laser beams in particular take a bit of working out given the frankly insane coverage that they have over the arena, but you can also naturally intuit that watching his heads is going to be the key to understanding the pathing of these beams, and from there, the rest is on you. Placidusax also never feels as if there isn't something for him to do to try and gain the upper hand, regardless of where he is or what direction he's facing relative to the player. Of course, he has close-range melee attacks, as well as attacks specifically meant to fire off from behind, attacks that cover a wide area across the massive arena. He can jump, fly away, and in his second phase, he can even teleport across short, medium, and long ranges to gain the upper hand as he prepares to unleash his next attack. You really get the feeling that this dragon is as wise as he is powerful, and it makes for a much more interesting fight than it would have been if he was just some insanely agile anime villain with breakneck speeds to his attacks and gotcha techniques for cheap damage. I mean it wholeheartedly when I say that I regard this fight as among the best that FromSoft has ever produced, and it feels bittersweet in a way seeing through the likes of Placidusax and Godfrey, as well as the other quality bosses I mentioned like Astel and Loretta, just how much potential there was for this game to be truly outstanding. Honestly though, imagine a DLC super boss where it's just 5-headed Placidusax. Actually, never mind. It probably would have been shit. If there was one thing that DLC taught me, it is to never let FromSoft, under any circumstances, put a character in their prime ever again. Jesus Christ.